Hi everyone, and welcome to another session during the Risk Awareness Week. This is the third session we're doing with Sam Savage and probabilitymanagement.org. And this time we have a new guest, a new expert in risk modeling, who will share a story with us. Eng Wee will join us shortly, and Sam will introduce him. But Sam, over to you to tell us a little bit about what's in store for us today.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Eng Wee Yo. He is a principal technology risk model at Kaiser Permanente and is our own assistant director of technologies and standards at probabilitymanagement.org. And I want to remind people that probabilitymanagement.org is trying to bring risk modeling to the masses. Our SIPMath standard, for example, lets you model really sophisticated simulations in native Excel or R or Python or anything you want. But primarily the Excel audience is the entry-level audience. I want to give you an example of the kind of model that you can build with the SIPMath tools. The SIPMath tools are free. They're an add-in for Excel. The model you build is native Excel. So the thing you're looking at is a project planner that I simply opened a new worksheet in Excel, and I went out and I searched for templates, and I searched for Gantt, and I found this Gantt chart. Well, this Gantt chart is a purveyor of the flaw of averages, because we just assume that every task in this project lasts a particular duration of time. But of course, we know there's a lot of uncertainty. So we modified this. The file, as you see it, is available on our website. So if I click the SIPMath button, this thing is suddenly doing a 1,000 trial Monte Carlo simulation, and I can scroll through the various scenarios that the project might take. And we were able to just layer the SIPMath technology on top of this template that we found out at Microsoft Office. So that's an example of what our technology can do. And again, it's a native Excel file. And now Eng Wee Yo is going to show us how he's been applying this. These are not actual Kaiser examples, but these are the kinds of things that he has been working on in the area of technology risk.
All right, thank you, Sam. And let me share my screen. So what I'm sharing today is basically technology risk modeling as it pertains to a risk mitigation project. Now, the underlying, risk analysis, it is kind of based off of the FAIR taxonomy, but what we're really doing here is really a cost-benefit analysis using stochastic analysis, right? So typically when we do an analysis, we kind of frame what the problem we are trying to solve. So this is kind of documented in the documentation page, which I'm sharing here. And really the objective here is, again, to identify risk planning scenarios as to whether or not further investment in this particular project. It's been anonymized, it's Roadrunner Speed Trap project that would benefit Acme Corporation, okay? So usually the first step that we do with regards to the analysis is we basically create an influence diagram, also known as a relevance diagram, to kind of determine which, what the uncertainties are as it relates to the analysis, what the objectives are, as well as what the decisions are. So it's kind of depicted in this diagram here. And for this particular analysis, we make several assumptions. First, that the project has a 1-year lead time to implement plan capabilities. So you don't get instant capabilities right off the bat. So it ramps up. That the capabilities have a 2-year ramp up to nominal operational effectiveness. That the risk we're looking at here is really the impact to Wile E. Coyote's well-being due to, again, the actions of Roadrunner. Okay, again, fully fictional, but that's okay. And then lastly, that the threat landscape grows at an exponential rate. So this is important because when we talk about risk scenarios, I'm really talking about two major drivers of uncertainty here, right? First of all is really the threat landscape, whether or not it is stable or volatile over the next 5 years. Also, the relative risk reduction capabilities of the project. So you have your two axes there. So together you have basically a 2x2 grid, which is what the next tab is all about. So in terms of the risk scenarios that we're modeling here, I gave them names. We have blue sky, which is really your stable threat landscape, high risk reduction capability type of scenario. Game on is really where you have a volatile threat landscape, but effective controls or highly effective controls. Stay vigilant is really when you have a stable environment, but your control effectiveness or your project is really just nominal in its capabilities to reduce risk. And then doomsday, the worst case scenario, right? You have a highly volatile threat landscape, but your controls are, or I should say your project isn't very effective in mitigating risk. So associated with each of the scenarios here are really strategy or scenario dependent variables, right? So you can set an upper and lower bound for your annual threat landscape change. So as you can see, 1 corresponds to blue sky, 2 to game on, 3 to stay vigilant, and 4 for doomsday. So for the stable threat landscape types of scenarios, we're looking at maybe 0 to 10% variation for threat landscape over 5 years. For the volatile, we're basically going all out and say, hey, it's going to be 100 to 200% change, right? Where basically you're basically a target for a campaign by the bad guys, so to speak. Okay, and then there are also variables associated with frequency reduction due to capabilities of the project, as well as variables related to impact reduction for the projects as well. And for each of them, again, lower and upper bounds, as you can define in the table over here to the right. Okay, so moving on.
Eng Wee, what does that 200% mean? No, wait, explain this again. This in terms of the table.
Yeah, so basically in terms of the frequency of attacks as well as the impact if an attack were to be successful, we're talking about increases of 100 to 200% per year, annual increases in the activity of the bad guys. It's like how bad do they want to get you? In this case, yeah, it's like well, hopefully not, but yeah.
And where are the initial probabilities or likelihoods?
The initial probabilities are kind of stated in the tables here. So again, lower bound and upper bounds again. So as you can see over here. Yep. Scenario 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. They all have different values. It's driven by the table. And then if you were to change, for example, the scenario, you see that the numbers will update accordingly as well, based off of what you defined there. Okay.
Got it.
So yeah, so I'm gonna stick to 1 here for now.
So the likelihoods themselves are being modeled stochastically.
They are correct. Yeah, but these are just the parameters that we kind of provide into the input variables for the model. So there are a few, right? First of all, you go with static assumptions that the project starts in this year, 2020. All right, and for discount rates, we're assuming 10%. It's just standard generic number to use. And then we look at exogenous uncertainties, the threat landscape, because that's really beyond our control. That's really based on the actions of the bad guys, right? Well, it'd be nice if we could negotiate with them, say, hey, let's go attack our competitors instead of us. But in the real world, maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't, but not in my world. So, all right. So in this case, we have the initial threat frequency increase. Again, these are defined as SPT, unbounded SPT matter logs. Okay, where we have a basically 80% credible interval. So we take the 10th percentile and the 90th percentiles as our boundaries. So we have 20% as the lower boundary, 80% as the upper bound, with a base or median value of 50%. All right. So if you look at the formula for this is really SPT metalog. So it's a 3-term metalog for the most part. And then we look at basically the growth parameters associated with threat landscape. We have annual threat frequency change rate, initial threat impact increase, and then annual threat impact change rate as well. So these are, exponential functions. Just for modeling purposes, you can choose any other functions, but for demonstration, I'm just going to say exponential growth, okay, on an annual basis. And then we move on to our program-related uncertainties. So this is really related to, two functions of the project: frequency reduction for threats, as well as impact reduction for events occurring as a result of, the threat events being successful. So again, we start off with an initial value, and then we kind of, look at number of years until the effectiveness ramps up. In this case, we state as 1 year based on our assumptions, and then the years of ramp up as well, right? So you have the beginning of the ramp up, and then how long it takes to ramp up in this case. So in this case, we started with a low estimate of 1, an upper estimate of 2 years. Again, this is a lower bounded SPT malloc with a lower bound of 0, but in this case, because we're looking at years, they have been kind of converted or basically rounded to integers. Okay.
So these are mitigation.
Yeah, these are mitigation related input parameters. Yeah, everything. This entire model is parametric, so to speak. Okay, where everything uses name ranges and everything is parametric. It's driven by parameters versus hard coding anything.
So you're starting with this threat landscape and the 4 big threats, right? And then here we have mitigation project that we're going to model going up against those threats, basically.
Exactly. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, again, frequency and impact are pretty similar. They have initial values, when the ramp up begins, how long it takes to ramp up, and the final values as well. So in this case, you see that it starts off at 0, but then it ends at 50 to 90% for this particular scenario, because it's high project effectiveness type of scenario. So 50 to 90%, and then for impact it's a different range, right? We use 30 to 60%, because again, based off of experience, most risk mitigation projects tend to work more on the frequency side of the equation, unless you're reducing the footprint of your risk posture. Like for example, scoping down the number of PHI records if you were in healthcare in the system. That would be reducing your impact because you have fewer records to compromise, so to speak. Okay, so it really depends on what we're looking at. So moving on to the next tab. This goes into the actual time series calculations, right? So the top part really is kind of like just your fair stuff, where you have, your loss frequency events, threat vulnerability, which is really how vulnerable you think your systems are, your threat event frequencies, which really, through a binomial distribution comes up with your loss event frequency, your single loss magnitude, which is a distribution, and then your risk exposure, which is again your IID for the single loss magnitude by the number of loss events. Okay, so at a high level.
And Eng Wee, and those red numbers, are those like individual trials?
Those are trials, yes.
So if you scroll through some trials, we'd see them change, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yep. So in terms of color convention, the models that work with are color coded. So good point there, Sam. Thank you. It's actually, as part of documentation, there's a style there. Choice values, like decisions, are in blue. Inputs that are like static inputs are in black. Placeholder values, those that you're not certain yet, are in red. Individual trials are orange, and then your statistics, basically overall trials, are basically in like teal, for example.
Okay. Yep. And I want to stop. I want to just stop here for a second. Alex, we founded a couple of different organizations. We are bringing a discussion of uncertainty into their organizations for the first time. They've been using averages. And as we mentioned, last time we talked, I like to think of, we're in a Rick and Morty cartoon and there are 1,000 parallel universes, right? That whole concept, to get that across, we believe that organizations should adopt like color coding schemes for these things. And in the latest version of the enterprise SIPMath tools, we have a color palette, so that as you're putting your models together, you can decide what colors you want to use for various concepts. And here, Eng Wee is using red for something that is one particular Rick and Morty universe of the parallel universes.
Yep.
So when you see those numbers, you know they're not constants. And if you go back to the original model and just do that again, Eng Wee, just where you just pick up where you left off, but now scroll through a few more trials. How many trials are in this model? 100, 1,000?
This is 10,000. That's why it's a little bit on the slower side. Because of
10,000 parallel universes. No, that's great, Eng Wee. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but I think for people who are first seeing this, there's a lot going on in this model. Oh, probably like, I don't know, 10 million moving parts. If you do 10,000 trials times God knows what. I mean, all sorts of, All right.
Okay. All right. So, so the top portion there is risk reduction, and the bottom part is really related to cost. If we go back to our, influence diagram or relevance diagram, we're now looking at the bottom portion of the diagram, right? So in terms of project costs, a lot of times these are pre-planned. So these are already provided as part of the business plan, so to speak, depending on organization. But you can't plug it in, right? You have your CapEx, your OpEx, and then your GA, general and, administrative expenses, your project management costs associated with that to come up with total cost. Again, first year, is we're kind of in the inception phase. There's no cost yet. And then, subsequent years, that's a cost. From there, we discount the rates to come up with cash flow. Well, you add them, and then you do a cash flow to come up with the ultimate, net present value for the value of the project that we're considering here. Okay, so what we then did was basically, because we have, again, 4 scenarios that we're modeling, what I then did was multiple experiments. So here we have the experiment table, which ties to the strategies. And then over here are the results in the form of percentiles, average, as well as negative chances. Again, this is a SIPMath functionality where you can now archive your original probability management table, create a new one, do your multi-experiments, and switch back to your original PM table, which is fantastic. Just plug for you there, Sam, but I found that immensely useful for this type of analysis. So once we have this, okay, so you have your different percentiles for your different scenarios.
So anyway, when you're talking about the multiple experiments here now, we've got the threats, and you're going to perform experiments with different types of mitigations. Is that right?
And threat landscapes, correct. Yep. So basically everything that you see here, you run through them with the different parameters, and then come up with your results in the experiment tab here, right? So that's what the outputs are.
Oh yeah. So you're going. So you got 4 strategies against the four threats, right?
The 4 strategies against it's the same threat, but different threat landscapes and different project effectiveness parameters is what we're testing against here. So like in this case, so this is scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, scenario 4. This is the multi-experiment results. It's just summarized neatly in a table here in the experiments tab. And the reason why we do this is because it allows us to do really nifty things. One extra feature that I would like to say is, with the layout of this, it's actually compatible with tools if you ever done work with Carl Spatzler's group, SDG. This allows you to create very nifty things, like, for example, a tornado diagram. So which you use the Torpix tool to do, right? You can calculate sensitivity, and boom, it does a tornado chart for each of your different scenarios right off the bat. Okay, so from there.
And wait, what technology were you using there? Is that from there?
That's one of the tools.
That's using their tools.
Yep, I ran an SDG tool on on a SIPMath model, and it works 100%.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent.
Okay, so not sure if anyone's done that yet, but okay, I'll claim, I'll have dibs on it if no one's done it yet. Okay. So yep. So yeah, this is using SDG to generate tornado diagrams off our SIPMath model.
And just explain the tornado diagram to us a little bit.
So basically, tornado diagrams are all about sensitivity analysis, right? They kind of basically what it does, it goes through values that you define in your model. So let me go back to mine. In this case, we kind of go to our inputs here, And you see that I have certain fields that have skip in them. It means, don't include in your sensitivity analysis. But in this case, we're looking at things like your annual threat frequency change rate, annual threat impact change rate, ramp up, years of ramp up, final effectiveness as really the inputs that we would like to add to our sensitivity analysis. So when you do that, what it does is, it fixes the values of the other variables of the model at basically their base rate, so to speak, and then it kind of adjusts, the lower and upper bounds for your the variable that you're looking at for sensitivity, right? So if I were to go back to the tornado diagram here, for example, for blue sky, you see that the parameter that really impacts the overall NPV for the model is really your final effectiveness for frequency reduction. And you can see that the cumulative variation explained, this one variable contributes to 84% of the total output.
Got it.
Of your NPV. Right, so the biggest bang for the buck, what can we do to reduce the chance of a negative return? We basically look at your tornado charts for those on top, right? The fat part of the tornado is what really impacts your NPV values. And the value for that is, when you go to a recommendations slide for management, we can do things like this, right? So we have our risk scenarios being explained here, blue sky, game on, stay vigilant, and doomsday. And then you kind of explain what those scenarios are. And then you can have insights to each of those scenarios. Like, for example, what should we prioritize for the project in this case, right? So if we were to say we want, if the threat landscape combination with risk reduction is, within the quadrant for stay vigilant to reduce the chance of a negative return, what we need to do is prioritize initiatives that reduce the frequency of risk events. And how do we know that? We ran the sensitivity analysis to kind of give us insight into that. Okay, so that's what the value this analysis brings to the table.
Well, I want to make another comment here. This is the first, you mentioned you had tied in some SDG technology, but I think that the real lesson here is that this whole thing becomes like Lego blocks somehow, right?
Yes.
You get into these standards. This is why standards are so important. Once you start having standardized representations of risk, then you're in Legoland, and you can start aggregating multiple models. You don't build a risk model that is just a monolithic. I like to think of these as giant sand castles that collapse under their own weights, as opposed to little modular, Lego blocks, and you can build buildings and then build cities out of the buildings and so on.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and because we're using open technologies, it's what makes it all possible, right? So on to the final step, right? The last step is really, coming to kind of see how the four scenarios play out as it relates to, again, at the end of the day, we want to see if this project brings value to the organization in reducing risk, right? And because we are modeling four different scenarios, you cannot just present one perspective, so to speak, right? So the way we did this was we actually created a decision tree out of that, right? Again, your four scenarios, kind of going by your threat landscape as well as your risk reduction. And again, as anyone who's done analysis knows, you don't have all your probabilities, given to you off the bat. Sometimes you have to kind of make educated estimates. So in this case, for example, we don't know whether or not this project is going to offer, low risk reduction or high risk reduction. So we just, say flip a coin. There's a 50% chance that the project will yield low risk reduction. There's a 50% chance that it will yield high risk reduction. Okay, but we do know that for just given the last 10 years or so, that most of the time the threat landscape, yes, you will get attacked by the bad guys, but you will not be persistently attacked by the bad guys nonstop, unless it's like a 1 in 5 year event. And that's kind of what we did, right? So if you were to say 1 in 5 year event and map that to a Poisson distribution, it works out to be 18% and 82% correspondingly for a stable threat landscape. And that's the assumption we would make when we model out, okay, what's basically the expected NPV for the 4 scenarios for this particular risk mitigation investment. What's interesting though is instead of just entering average values, which we typically do, right? Your probably weighted averages for your n values. What we have done is we actually plugged in actual distributions, SIP vectors really, from the model that we just saw, right? So blue sky, game on, stay vigilant, as well as doomsday. So you see that each of these are 10,000 values. Okay, so
now can you go to the trials, hit the trials button and
let me close the other one so I don't mess it. Yeah, let me close the other one first so I don't mess it up. Yeah. Okay. So wait. How do I make this go away? Okay, so map true. Okay, so if I were to do trial info, okay, I'm going to do, see that?
Right.
These are SIPs. They are not probably weighted averages. They're not expected values as you typically do in a decision tree. All right. So what this also means then is that your n node is also a probability distribution. All right. So what this does then is, it allows us to basically create the expected value. I call it EV because I couldn't think of a better name when I was doing this, which is really the outcome of the different SIPs here with the different probability distribution allocations to come up with the final probability distribution for this particular project. And what that looks like is this. The overall value for this project, as you can see, you have your P01 to all the way to P99s. What your average return is, what's the chance that you'll get your average return, as well as what's the chance of a positive return. And here's the loss exceedance curve for this particular project. So it's as with most risk mitigation projects. Again, this is hypothetical, right? This is not using real numbers. It's using there's zero correlation with real numbers because it's been randomized so many times. But you can tell it's still consistent with most risk mitigation projects where most of the time, the losses that you see that it mitigates, are disproportionate to the amount of money you invest. But when bad things happen, that's when the value comes into play. It's almost like a form of insurance, right? That's why selling security projects is so difficult.
Got it.
Right.
So Eng Wee, just hold on a second. You've been using a lot of technologies here. So the SIP math simulation tools, there's a free version of those. The tree you used was our Excel tree. That's also free at probabilitymanagement.org. The stuff from SDG, is that a free tool or not? The tornado diagram thing.
It's free if you attend the courses. So I got mine because I'm on the tail end of the SDRM certificate program with UT Austin. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm sort of breathless here as I'm watching these, technologies be tied together, really like Lego blocks.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. So from there, if you were to present this as a executive type presentation, this is where you kind of show, okay, this is where we are. You have you have a 7% chance of your average return of minus 2 million. This again is a security project, so most of the time people do not bulk at negative NPVs for security projects because most of them are anyways. So and then you show the loss exceedance curve, right? So that's a 6% chance that you'll get a positive return. And then, that's when you open up for discussion and, they can ask you all kinds of questions. But the real value here is it starts them thinking of asking the right questions with regards to projects like this.
Right.
And if I can just ask a question, because, this is amazing stuff. And the best part of what you're showing us, and is that you went further than just doing a kind of a common for technology risk loss exceedance curve where you multiply the probability of event happening with the potential range of consequences and you get a loss exceedance curve. you went further and you've separated the losses with the cost associated and the reduction in losses. So you literally created like a full-on NPV model, and that becomes an investment decision. So it's not a kind of highly narrow conversation about, well, what's the likely, or what's the value at risk, 95 for a technology risk. It goes further. It's what's the business benefit from mitigating that particular risk, which is a very important message for all of the cyber folks that are watching us, that if you want to kind of have a conversation with the executives, you have to speak their language. A loss exceedance curve, which tells you that you are 95% of the chance expected to lose less than $500,000 due to this threat, is a pretty boring conversation for a CFO to have. But then if you kind of turn it into, this is how much we need to invest, and this is the payoff that we're going to get on this investment, and there's a probability of a positive business return, that's a very different message that executives can listen. Although, obviously I haven't been involved in a lot of technology risk conversations, because seeing a 6% probability of a positive return, that would be a very weird investment in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yes.
No, but it's insurance. It's insurance, right?
It is insurance. Yep. You're protecting against the tail end. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And then there are other kinds of technology projects that are involved with regards to, for example, things like contact tracing programs, where your valuation is different. You're basically counting in terms of lives saved. And if you would convert that to financial values, then you have a very high, return on NPV for a very low cost, right? So it's a whole spectrum, it's a whole gamut, and it really depends on the domain in which we are, trying to kind of look at those projects, because you cannot put them in the same bucket. I mean, for the most part, right? You have to kind of, bin them so that, for risk mitigation, most of them will have negative NPVs, but looking at the portfolio, that's when you can do a little bit of optimization, right? You build a Pareto front, so to speak, and then you say, okay, these are the ones that we want to invest in because they give you the most bang for the buck, depending on what value measures we want to use, right?
Yeah.
So
well, let's talk about the portfolio. Let's talk about the portfolio, because the way I often introduce portfolio theory is to say, fire insurance is a ridiculous investment unless you have a house in your portfolio to go with it. Nobody just buys fire insurance without having a house. And I'm not going to buy a fire insurance policy on Alex's house. No, it's my house, Alex. And my fire insurance policy. So that's the idea behind portfolio theory, is it's the interrelationship between assets or liabilities that you're really managing. And I know that I think Sean Doheny is going to be talking about this in a future session here on looking at portfolios of cyber risk mitigation projects. But that's all possible. When you're in Legoland, right? When you're in Legoland, you can tie all these things together. And in fact, staying with the Legoland analogy, suppose we're building all these, our business units are like little buildings in Legoland. And one of our threats is a flood, okay? Well, you've got a building, Alex, Eng Wee has a building, I've got a building, we're all modeling our buildings individually. But we can have a single SIP library of floods, this is our threat scenario, right, that we all share. And on trial 1, we all get a 1-foot flood. And on trial 2, we all get a 30-foot flood. And on trial 3, we get a 2-foot flood. If we use that same SIP of flood levels, then we can all estimate our own distributions of risk. And at the end of the day, we can add those SIPs together to get the enterprise-wide risk, right? And And we're actually talking to insurance companies now about doing this sort of thing. They do it internally already. I mean, I really want to stress this, that the whole idea of SIPs, they weren't called that, but this goes back to financial engineering. It goes back to insurance. It goes back to stochastic optimization. These are quite old ideas, but they were not democratized. There was no common standard so that people could build Legoland with them, for example.
Totally, and I want to just continue on what you're saying, Sam, and connect it to the other workshops that you and I did and other participants from probability management, because Eng Wee showed us the example of doing the quantification of technology risk, and that has a lot of kind of building blocks that go into it. And we talked in the first session during this Risk Awareness Week, we talked about crowdsourcing models. And then in the second session, we talked about crowdsourcing specific distributions.
Exactly.
And I think this is the future of quantitative risk analysis and quality decision making, where each one of us, individual risk managers or decision scientists or decision professionals or decision support analysts in our individual companies, we don't all have to come up with distributions or even parts of the model. We can just buy or use building blocks that are available somewhere in the global marketplace. I find it absolutely ridiculous that I still have to model my foreign exchange and interest rates.
Right.
That is just insane. Why do I have to model, sit somewhere in the corporation and model something that every single risk manager on the planet is using?
Yeah.
Why do we have to model it a million different times?
Alex, that is an entrepreneurial opportunity right there.
Mm-hmm.
We should simply fix that by, we'll fit a metalog to it and just publish it somewhere. Really, I'm serious. It's so easy to do. We'll just do it, and because it solves another problem, the crowdsourcing. You can go to management, because management says, well, how do you know what the distribution is, right? First of all, remember, management now says, give me a number so I can perpetuate the flaw of averages, right? Well, when you start telling me to use distributions, they're going to say, okay, then I want to make sure I have the right distribution. Give me the exact distribution. Well, first of all, like horseshoes and hand grenades, close counts. But secondly, they're going to say, well, where did you get that distribution? If you can say, well, this is the one that everybody is using, right? Then you cross that hurdle. And this is not even a new concept. If you go to the idea of implied volatility in option pricing, right? That's from 1974 or 75, whenever Black and Scholes published their paper. The implied volatility that you read out of an option price is precisely a crowdsourced distribution. And the beauty of free markets is they really do crowdsourcing, right? And there are some other wonderful examples of this as well. There's an agricultural nonprofit called FarmDoc, which gives you the distribution of the future prices of soybeans and corn based on the crowdsourcing of futures prices. Basically, people buying and selling futures for these commodities, and off of that, using basically a Black-Scholes methodology, they can back out the actual distribution of prices. So again, what you need to benefit from that is the standard. How do I now convey that information in a standard way so that Eng Wee can use it in his Legoland, you can use it in your Legoland, and so on.
I think one thing is clear, is the next Risk Awareness Week will be called the the global risk marketplace.
Oh, there you go. That's a good theme. I like that. Yeah.
I love it. And let me tell you, there's a wonderful word for that. So the stochastic, when I had to come up with words for SIPs, right? Before I had a word, I wanted to tie in to a meme that already existed, right? So you're used to bit and byte. You've got bit and byte emblazoned in your brains, right? And like designing a new meme is like designing a new drug. It's got to fit into some receptor somewhere, right? So I wanted to go to the bit and byte receptor. So I immediately came up with SIP and SLURP, right? I didn't know what they'd stand for. And we had this discussion before. Stochastic information packet and stochastic library unit with relationships preserved. And at an early meeting at Informs, maybe 10 years ago, 15 maybe, I asked the group, I said, well, what would gulp mean? Or actually maybe someone in the audience says, well, what does gulp mean, right? And I said, okay, that's for you guys to decide. Here it is. Here it is. And we can introduce it at your conference. Global Universal Library of Probabilities.
Oh, Sam, you are. Yeah.
Everyone who is watching us, you're witnessing the future born for risk analysis.
Yeah. But okay, I have to give attribution. That was thought up by Richard Williamson of works for Walmart Labs, and he gets attribution for that in my book. So he's the guy who came up with the meaning of gulp. Now I thought I would just encourage people, if I may, to go to our website and take a look at, if you go to the applications page, there are all these different models. So if I go to project management, for example, there's our original work on the shell model. There's that Gantt chart. We can go back to models on climate change, financial management, pandemic modeling, military readiness. These are all in their infancy. Now, the things have been applied in really major applications at organizations that we can't talk about. And before probability management, the whole notion of the SIP libraries, not being called that, were used at big financial engineering firms, but all within siloed applications. But these are all just Excel models. You can just go out, and there's our flood model, just to get you thinking about this stuff. Freely available to play with, and we hope you'll come browse the site.
Perfect, thanks, Sam, and thank you. And any final thoughts? Any kind of messages to wrap up? And by the way, everyone who's watching, don't forget to ask questions and write comments underneath this video. I mean, this has been an amazing presentation, and we shared an example on how to apply proper quantitative risk analysis to something that for ages has been considered unquantifiable technology risk. And truth be told, I mean, it's kind of funny, and this is, by the way, this is the message that I'm trying to repeat all the time. There's a very limited number of the actual tools that we use. And when I say tools, I don't mean software, I mean the actual techniques, the influence diagrams, decision trees, simulations, scenarios, sensitivity analysis. There's very limited number of actual kind of, the things that you can draw on a piece of paper. And for example, what Eng Wee showed for technology risk, it's exactly the same thing that we have done 5 years ago for an intellectual property problem. Somebody asked, a big telecom company in the country asked us to quantify the risks associated with new product development and the consequences. One of our outcomes was the probability of an executive being jailed because according to the law for breaking the intellectual property rights, there was one of the there were fines, and there were obviously ranges of different fines that we had to estimate, but there was also one of the consequences was jail time, and we had to estimate the probability of jail time as one of our outputs for the quantitative model. So we gave them the dollar amount and the probability of jail in the results window. But we applied exactly the same decision tree with Monte-Carlo sitting on top of it. And it's amazing how many different world problems we can apply those techniques to.
Yes. So first of all, I want to thank you, Alex, for all the wonderful work you've done in this area. I want to thank Eng Wee for all the wonderful work he's done. What we find now is people are coming in out of the woodwork, right? I mean, Doug Hubbard, Tom Keelan with his metalogs, other people that you've met who are being attracted now to probabilitymanagement.org. And so if you look at all technologies, they take a long time to get going. And again, I go back to my favorite, sort of my role model, Fibonacci, who brought Hindu-Arabic numerals to Italy in 1199. And, I don't know, 50 years later or something, they were still trying to outlaw Hindu-Arabic numerals in Florence. So it's a struggle. In today's world, however, with electronic communication, these things can take off a lot faster. And it is a one-way street. Once you realize the flaw of averages, right, you cannot, with a straight face, go back to the old-fashioned kind of modeling. And yet, there's so much infrastructure in place. Our accounting codes in many places actually codify the flaw of averages, right? Which is ridiculous. Anyway,
I think all of financial certifications, all of university degrees are literally just reinforcing the flaw of averages. You know what I think would be super fun? If one of the countries outlawed stochastic analysis, just made it illegal, because the legislators would be too dumb to understand it, and they would just outlaw it, and then we would become renegades, and that would be, I think that would just be kind of the highlight of my life.
Well, we're already renegades. Have no doubt about that.
Yeah, we'll be the Rebel Alliance.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Dear audience, I hope you had as much fun as we did. Please share this session with your colleagues, because obviously you can see there's a lot of valuable application of stochastic risk analysis. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you in future.
So long, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.